Welcome to the Art of Plenty. Let's talk about how creativity is a necessary part of personal development. So how do you actually boost your creativity to get the most out of your personal development? You see, I have always been a person who is a creative, even long before I even used those words or knew what those words meant. Being creative has always been such a source of joy for me and such a source of release. It's one of those things that when I get an opportunity to be creative, I feel like it's filling me up. I feel so much thankfulness and joy and excitement. And even if the process of creating is long or arduous and takes a lot of effort, I still really enjoy the steps along the way and also seeing what the final product is that I actually create. Now, when I was little, and it was in the 80s and I was growing up, when we talked about being creative, we often used the words like crafty. I was constantly making things like reindeer out of wooden spoons or these tiny little fans that we would decorate with artificial flowers that were made out of scraps of wallpaper. Because back in the 80s, everybody was wallpapering absolutely everything. And they would have these books that you could get at the paint store. They were catalogs for ordering wallpaper because, again, we didn't have the internet, so we weren't looking for wallpaper on the internet. We were actually looking in wallpaper books. So when they would retire these books, you could get them and then you could make these fans. I don't even know what we did with them. Like maybe hung them on the Christmas tree, put them on presents. I have no idea, but I remember making wallpaper fans and people had scraps of wallpaper left over, which is probably more so where we use them rather than getting the retired wallpaper sample books. But I did a lot of that type of crafting type stuff. I was constantly burning my fingertips on glue guns. I learned how to crochet, how to knit, how to sew. I would make my own patterns as I got older. And when I was about 9 years old, I actually made a dress and put a zipper in it. So my mom was the person that kind of spearheaded this, and I think she just knew that I was inclined in that direction. So she was constantly creating opportunities for me to have creativity as an outlet. But I never really considered myself artistic, and I never thought of myself as an artist. It wasn't until I was in high school and I had taken a couple art classes where I actually felt like, oh, maybe I am artistic, which is so funny to me because I had spent my life creating, which is what an artist does. But I just had such a narrow view of what it meant to be an artist because I didn't really draw. And I definitely didn't draw. And I didn't really paint or do anything like that. And that is what I associated with being artistic and being creative. And it's funny because I have a daughter who feels the same way about herself. She's incredibly creative. She writes a lot of music on the piano, and she one time won this contest. It was a coloring contest essentially, and she wasn't into coloring at all. So she had taken all of these different color threads because at that time she was making a lot with yarn. She was making toques and all sorts of interesting things. And she used the yarn to essentially color the picture and ended up winning this coloring contest because of her ingenuity. And I remember her asking me, well, is this even going to be allowed? And I said, I don't know, because sometimes with contests, they have regulations and you actually have to color or you have to use a specific medium. But does that even matter to you? Does it matter to you if you win or if it's accepted? Or is it about expressing yourself in a way that feels true to who you are? She has the same narrow view of herself that she's not an artist because she doesn't draw and she doesn't even like to draw. So she limits her sense of self regarding creativity because she doesn't associate what she does with what she considers to be an artist, which is kind of like my childhood view of a very traditional artist. There is an incredible connection between being creative and being able to solve problems. And this is the piece of why creativity is such a necessary component of personal development. When you go through the process of personal development and you're looking for ways to be better and to improve yourself on different facets, like your emotional health or your cognitions and changing the way you're thinking or improving your relationships, whatever it is that you're focusing on, it requires a level of flexibility, a level of willing to look at it from different angles and pull it out and see it in different ways. And that's essentially what it means to be creative, is to come at things from a different perspective and to be able to hold space for something that's novel or something that's new or something that's going to change, which is exactly what you're doing in personal development. You are doing something new. You're creating a new way of being, a new way of behaving, a new way of feeling, a new way of thinking, a new way of acting in your relationships. So when you boost your creativity in other areas, such as actually creating, it has a trickling effect into other parts of your life, so that all of a sudden you're able to think differently about problems that you're coming up against at work. So it has a way of expanding your horizons so that you're more capable in the situations that you're in. Now, I got to tell you this. There have been times in my life, particularly when I was younger, I'm much more flexible with myself now, where I had a lot of perfectionism and high standards. When I was younger, I was very critical of myself. I wanted to do things that were excellent. Now, this could actually be one of the reasons why I never actually spent time drawing or painting or creating in those more traditional ways when I was younger. I didn't have the skill set to do or create to the level that I expected of myself. Now, of course, I wasn't going to be able to create at the level because I had such an unrealistic expectation for myself when it came to certain things like creating. Whereas the crafts that I would do when I was little, it was easy to meet that high standard because just the way my brain worked and the level of difficulty, it was easy. I couldn't see a comparison of necessarily how to improve it. Not that there wasn't ways to improve it, because there most certainly was. But I was freer in those creative endeavors because I was able to meet some level of my standard. And I noticed this a lot with my kids when they're drawing, is that at different times, different kids have gotten really frustrated when the art that they're trying to create isn't how they think that they should be able to create. Now, I have one son in particular who is actually a phenomenal artist. He's incredible. And when I say artist, I'm actually talking about drawing. He's a phenomenal drawer. Is that a word? Is that how you would say it? And he doesn't have that same harshness around things being perfect or the same high standard. It's not that he doesn't have standards, but he has a lot more freedom and flexibility in his expectations of self. And I think what that has afforded him is space to actually draw and get better. And as parents, we've nurtured that in him. We've encouraged him and pointed out, because he had a natural talent for it when he was young, and we noticed it. So we celebrated it, which caused him to take more risks in it. And because he's one of my older kids, my other kids have followed suit. And I have quite a few now that actually are excellent drawers because they've spent the time and they've put time into honing that craft. What shifted for me with my art was a few years back, and I have never really painted. That's not been a creative venture of my life. I have been interested in painting and I've taken, the odd watercolor class, but it's not something that I necessarily explored as a creative person. And a few years ago, I decided that I was going to start painting. And I honestly don't even know what it was about painting that I was drawn to, but I knew that creating and investing in creating was going to be connected to my health, and it was going to be a way to bring healing into my life. So I kind of dove into this idea that I was going to paint, and this was going to be an outlet and a way to move towards health. And when I started painting, I made the decision right at the beginning that it was not going to be about the product. It was going to be about the process for me. And I think that the reason why I was able to set that boundary around my painting, around my art, was because I knew that the reason why I was doing it, the intention I was doing it, was related to healing and health. So because of that, the health was going to come through the process of creating, not from the product that I had created. So it was very easy. And what was incredible to me, and what I have so much gratitude for, is that idea that creating is about the process and not the product has actually stretched into other avenues in which I create, where I don't feel the same burden to create to a high standard as I used to. I'm more relaxed about it and more settling into the process and enjoying being a creative person. And that has been an incredible gift for me. So here is tip number 1 for how to boost creativity in your own life. And it's just what I said. Choose the process of creating over the product. Knowing that you're not just creating for the sake of the final product, you're creating for the process, and you're creating for what it's going to do and open up in other areas of your life, in your relationships, in the way you approach work, in solving problems, in being more present with your family. The list could go on, because depending on how you feel about creating and what creating does for you, it's one of those things that has the ability to feed your soul if you lean towards that direction. And I also just want to point out that just like I had a very narrow view of what it meant to be artistic and be creative when I was little, sometimes we need to shift that. You can be creative in the way that you design your workouts. That is an element of creativity. So if you're thinking, I'm not a creative person, I don't like making things, I don't really like using my hands, I just want to encourage you just to expand your perspective on what even it means to be creative, because it's not just about doing something with your hands. It could be many things, even in the way that you think or the way that you build relationships. So that was tip number 1, focus on the process, not on the product. I was recently talking with a friend of mine who is an artist for his vocation. So every day he works, and when he works, he is creating art. And he often works in the evening because that's the schedule that works for his family. And at that time, he has to sit down and he has to produce. He doesn't have time to wait for feeling like it, or to have, I guess, like a flood of like, oh, this is what I'm excited about and I'm feeling so inspired. He actually just has to do it. There's no time for waiting for a muse to show up, because his livelihood is dependent on his ability to continue to create art. So my tip number 2 for boosting creativity is commit to it. If you are wanting to increase this, don't dilly-dally around waiting to be inspired or thinking that that's how artists work, that they wait for an inspiration and then they sit down and they write this incredible piece of poetry, or they go to the canvas and all of a sudden this wave comes over them and they have this masterpiece of art. Art can be so much more pragmatic, and it comes out of being intentional and industrious. Go and do it. So my second tip for boosting creativity is to commit to it. Lately, some of my most cherished personal development times in the last couple of years have been going to this group therapy, it's kind of like an art group therapy with a small selection of women. And I've absolutely loved it. So we get together, we start with a circle, and then we create as individuals. So there's no talking. Sometimes there's a bit of music, and you're working on this individual piece of art. And then afterwards, you come back to the circle and you share about what you created, because that process of sharing drops into you what that piece of art meant to you. And because it's therapy, you're working things out. Now, one of the things that I've taken away from that group is when you're looking at other people's art and when you're looking at your own art, when you're looking at what you've created, you don't come at it with a perspective of judging it. Oh, I like what you did there, or that stands out. And this matters because when you are critical of something that you are doing, when you are judgmental about the process of what you've done, you are stifling your creativity. It's like a brainstorming station. When you brainstorm, you just get every idea you can. There's no such thing as a bad idea. And the reason why you do that is because it triggers a flow of ideas that allows more ideas and more ideas to come out. If you judge your ideas in a brainstorming session and you're like, oh, that's not a good idea, I'm not going to write that down, I got to wait for the next idea, it stifles the process so that you can't actually get into really good creative ideas. That it hampers your ability to be expansive and come up with other ideas, and ideas that you maybe don't have at the tip of your iceberg, because ideas lead to more ideas. And when you judge your art, when you're critical of your art, it does the same thing. It creates a restriction which impacts your ability to create the next time. So it doesn't mean that you're going to love everything about what you are creating. And I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying just look at the art and notice it. So rather than take a judgment stance, take an observational stance. So that was tip number 3. Don't judge your art and don't judge yourself about the process that you're going through. Rather than that, think about, how is creating serving me? What is the gift that is being given to me by going through this process of creating? And I just want to settle into that a little bit, because as I mentioned before, when I've created in more recent years, I knew it was connected to me for healing. So when I would go into a place of creating art, I would think about, this is healing for me, and this is how I'm nurturing this part of me, this physical part of me, this emotional part of me, this mental part of me. So that would be tip number 4, is to think about, how is this serving you, and recognize when it is in fact doing that. Because when you feel like, oh, this is making a difference for me, you're more likely to want to do that, and it's going to boost your creativity. There's these 2 authors that had written this book. I believe it's called Wired for Creativity, and the authors are Kaufman and Gregoire. And they talk about the paradoxes that exist in being creative. And why I appreciate that is because I think in life in general, when we're living our best lives, we're kind of dancing between these paradoxes. And I talk a little bit about this in my course, The Integrated Life, where I talk about, on one hand, we need to be so content and satisfied with where we are at, and so accepting of our present situation. But paradoxically, at the same time, when we're feeling so much satisfaction, we also need to be feeling that pull to improve, that insatiability for improving and changing our lives. Because when we're sitting in that place of acceptance, yeah, it's good for now. But if you stay there in a year from now, where you were isn't going to cut it for where you're going to be. So we have to struggle, or not necessarily struggle, but go back and forth between these two places, and they're paradoxically different. So these two authors talk about the different paradoxes in creativity, which are, they identify this idea of being mindful versus letting your mind wander, this idea of being intuitive versus reasoning, openness versus sensitivity, play versus seriousness, and creating dances between these paradoxes, these four different ones. And I love that concept because when I create, I can feel that this intensity that I have and this seriousness for doing things while also allowing myself to play while I create. And that is my next tip for boosting creativity. Tip number 5 is to give yourself permission to explore, to go between being very intentional and mindful, but also just to let your mind wander, to be intuitive about the way you're creating, but also use a lot of reason and structure in the process of creating. I did an episode, it was episode 9, about daydreaming. And if you're a person who struggles to dream and daydream and to let your mind wander, go back and have a listen to episode 9, because it'll help you to unpack that ability to dream again, because it's so essential when you're boosting your creativity. So that was 5 tips. And if you've got someone in your life who you know is a creative person who's maybe not been able to be creative, or you've noticed they're not as creative as they used to be, maybe send them this episode so that they can work at boosting their creativity. And drop me a line if any of these tips are speaking to you, because I would love to hear from you. It warms my heart when people reach out and ask me questions or make comments on the content I'm creating, because I want to engage with you. I want to know what you're thinking about. I want to know what you're working through. I want to know what you're struggling with, because I want to be able to create content that resonates for you. So if I'm hitting the mark, but there's something more that you want to hear from me, send me a message, get on my email subscription list, because I want to talk to you and I want to know what's going on in your life. My name is Amy McInnes. This is The Art of Plenty.